Micro Four Thirds, it's been a format around for a long time at this point. It was the original mirrorless camera. Is it still relevant? Is it still a good option compared to APS-C and full frame cameras available? The most exciting thing for Micro Four Thirds right now is that Lumix Panasonic just released the G9 Mark II, which has phase detect on the sensor. It brings Panasonic to the most advanced recent autofocus system. It's good for video a lot of the time. Obviously, when you're focusing for photos, you get some jitter and stuff with their contrast-based systems. This should alleviate that. It'll be more confident to use, more consistent, most likely. Nice to see. Obviously, this is not a cheap camera, but with a lens, you've got $2,500, probably $2,000 or so. Just for the camera itself. They have the GH series for straight video stuff, although they have been including a lot more video functionality with the G9 series. So I'm not going to talk too much about this specific camera, but expect high weather resistance, high quality, at least in the United States, 3-year warranty, which is higher than usual. Most camera companies only have 1-year warranties. But is this really the focus of Micro Four Thirds, these large, robust cameras that are pretty expensive? I don't know. It seems to be the way that it's going. Maybe it's just going to turn into a specialty market of these specific types of cameras. Let's take a look at what else is out there. I haven't personally purchased any Micro Four Thirds cameras. I have handled them occasionally. When my friends came to this area, we went and did a little photo walk at an event. Canon stuff and half Micro Four Thirds Olympus stuff. So I got to take a look at that. That's the last time I can remember actually using it or trying it, like handling it at the very least. If we take a look at mirrorless cameras sorted by newest of Micro Four Thirds, we've got the G9 II. The body itself is $1,900. So that's pretty pricey in my opinion, considering there are other options. APS-C, you're going to get about 1 stop of additional ISO performance on APS-C or 2 stops in the case of full frame. And considering full frame now has cameras like the A7C, it's a pretty compact camera. It's tough to potentially justify something like this in comparison. In my opinion, I think Micro Four Thirds would be more interesting as a format if they had a bunch of smaller ultra compact cameras to go along with very compact lenses, so they would fill in the gap of something between a smartphone and full frame basically. APS-C is still around. I don't see them going away. It's mixed up now that APS-C and Micro Four Thirds are kind of in this leeway, so I personally have always gone with the APS-C stuff. If we sort Adorama's cameras by price, Canon R100, which is the cheapest camera right now, new, and it has a good amount of features. 24 megapixel, 4K, 24 frames a second video. Compared to some Micro Four Thirds, it's probably not as featured video-wise. Micro Four Thirds does have the G7, which is getting pretty old, with a lens for the same price. So technically it is competing favorably to the Canon that doesn't include a lens. You're not going to have phase detect on this camera. Hopefully they'll update this series to include newer features, more functionality. So the G7 and then the G100, in my opinion, was a bad release on Panasonic's part. They tried to market this thing as a vlog camera, but it does not have sensor-based stabilization, does not have good readout performance, does not have good autofocus performance, so it just failed on every aspect. Although I do think it had an interesting microphone setup, so hopefully they revised this camera to actually fit the market they were trying to target. Also, the lens included is not good on the wide end, because usually vlogging should be wider than 24, considering stabilization is going to eat into some of that field of view. So at the very least, it does look like some Micro Four Thirds cameras are on the cheaper ends. I think they really need to revise all that cheaper stuff to make it more appealing compared to APS-C options. Canon M200, this is basically a dead format in my opinion. I still have EFM equipment, so I personally would not get an EFM camera at this point unless you're very happy with everything and you don't care about upgrading anything or getting new features in the camera itself, because chances of getting a new version of this at this point is very slim in my opinion. So I feel like Micro Four Thirds could potentially fill all of the gaps that something like EFM will leave. I would like to see smaller and smaller Micro Four Thirds cameras. It's just the smallest thing is probably this G100. So in this case, I have a G9 Mark II and the OM5, which is kind of on the mid-range of these cameras. It does have phase detect on the sensor. So you can see there is a significant difference in size between these two cameras. OM5 looks like an interesting, relatively compact option. Compared to the M50, you can see the M50 is actually smaller with a larger sensor. Considering the sensor size difference, let's say you have f 5.6 lens on the Canon. You'd have to have an f4 lens on the Lumix to get kind of the equivalent look. So that is a negative. Let's take a look at these Micro Four Thirds lenses sorted by newest. I have a 35 to 100 f2.8 for $1,200. It looks relatively compact. If I had a 2.8 APS-C lens, probably quite a bit larger. 100 to 400. If you are doing telephoto work, it seems like Micro Four Thirds is a potential option here. Although f4 to 6.3 isn't great. 12 to 60, 3.5 to 5.6. So they don't even try to improve the aperture range here on this lens. You could basically get the same thing with the APS-C kit lens and then have that additional one-stop benefit. 45 2.8. Still, it's very expensive. Micro Four Thirds has a very long history now of lens offerings. In this case, these new lenses are pretty expensive considering the aperture ranges. Some of them might be a deal depending on if you want a telephoto lens, something like that that's a little more specialty. But a 14 to 150 f4 to 5.6, so the aperture range isn't great considering the smaller sensor, and $650. 12 to 35 2.8. This one, a larger maximum aperture than generally a kit lens or something a little bit higher end on APS-C would be, but it's still $900 for the lens. 9mm f1.7. It's pretty interesting looking. A unique Micro Four Thirds type option. So 18mm equivalent field of view, and f1.7 is going to give you a decent amount of light into the camera. So I'd say this is one of the first unique, interesting lenses I've seen in this list so far. And the price doesn't seem terrible considering what you're getting. 40 to 150 f4. At the very least, this has an f4 maximum aperture through the range. So 150 f4. Again, considering the one-stop disadvantage of this format, or two stops if you're going full frame, that's an interesting option at the very least. 25 to 50 f1.7 Panasonic 25 to 50 f1.7. So 50 to 100mm, $1,800, not cheap. It looks pretty large, probably nice optically, but f1.7, let's take a look at the aperture chart here. So if it's f1.7, approximately around here, and I want those two stops, so 1, 2, full frame, you'll be 3.2 to 3.5, pretty compact full frame lens, where if you go with APS-C, you're probably not going to find something like that, and it'll probably be a full frame lens. So you could potentially benefit over an APS-C camera in this situation. $1,800, easily buy a 70 to 200 f4 and just take a little bit of a hit in ISO performance. Looking at B&H sorted by price, let's take a look at Micro Four Thirds options new in autofocus. You have a 25 f1.7 prime for $150. It's a pretty nice deal. I'm sure you could find similar stuff in APS-C like this. So it's basically a 50mm f1.7, considering the two-stop disadvantage to full frame or the one-stop disadvantage to APS-C. You could probably find a f2.8 type lens or whatever in those formats that's probably pretty compact. So I wouldn't say there's an advantage in this situation. The next cheapest lens, 45 to 150 f4 to 5.6. The aperture range here is pretty standard with APS-C lenses. 90 to 300mm field of view equivalent. Decent range on it, but at 5.6, 300mm, considering the two-stop disadvantage, is not great. Olympus 40 to 150. Again, this aperture range, it is compact. It's a zoom lens with a decent range, but your apertures are going to suffer here. So let's keep going until we find something with a good aperture. 25mm, so basically 50mm equivalent field of view, f1.7. We look at our f chart again. We go to 1.7 around here, go to one stop or two stops. You're going to look at a 3.2 to 3.5 for full frame, or the 2.2 to 2.5 APS-C. Could probably find lenses like that are relatively compact with those apertures. So there's no point comparing that lens to a f1.4 or something in a full frame lens. You also have the Sigma primes. These specific Sigma lenses are on basically every system, even EFM. So you're not going to really get any benefit here, and it's going to be a larger lens than it potentially has to be or could be with Micro Four Thirds. 20mm f1.7, so 40. Again, f1.7 at the very least, it's a nice, or maximum aperture, I should say. So there are some pretty compact options here. 2014, and they have a nice aperture. Well, 2.5 isn't amazing, but at the very least, they're trying to compensate for the sensor size disadvantage. Although something like this, 14 to 42mm, f3.5 to 5.6, Field of view on the wide end is not great. Aperture range is not great. If you were to get that as a kit lens, you're going to have a camera that's at a disadvantage compared to APS-C cameras with their kit lens. Browsing these lenses that are new with autofocus, there are some interesting options, but I'm not seeing the advantage here of, say, size versus the equivalent type of lens in full frame or APS-C. APS-C itself doesn't necessarily get a lot of specific APS-C focused lens releases, so that's a disadvantage for that format compared to this one or full frame. The benefits I see of Micro Four Thirds, the potential small size compared to APS-C cameras. That doesn't seem to be the case a lot of the time. There are cameras like the OM5 that do look pretty small, also have a good amount of functionality with buttons and dials and things like that, but I feel like they could go even smaller and try to join those with a bunch of really compact, decent quality, larger aperture lenses in that system. Hopefully they go that direction eventually, but it seems like obviously they have benefits like the weather resistance or a good match for long telephoto lenses. You currently have a lot of video focused cameras in Micro Four Thirds, which is fine. You can have higher sensor readouts potentially, but I don't think the sensors get as much love or as much attention as stuff in APS-C and full frame do with improvements of technology. So that's kind of a detriment to Micro Four Thirds. They have all the people focused on telephoto lenses and telephoto options, birding and sports and things like that with Micro Four Thirds. So that's a benefit there. And I understand having a larger camera in those two situations. Sure. Compared to a phone, I could see Micro Four Thirds filling that gap, things like that. Hopefully they improve the bottom end and try to get a lot of good value out of the Micro Four Thirds system with improving the bodies. That something like the G100 is a bunch of old technology in a relatively compact body. So something like the M10, I don't think has phase detect. It just seems like they're not putting enough effort into the lower end, into really compact cameras. Hopefully they go that route eventually. That would probably make me interested in stuff like that. The type of camera I'd like to see more and more of in Micro Four Thirds is the GX85 style. Something very compact, something has potentially sensor-based stabilization, has phase detect hopefully on the sensor for a good autofocus. I don't know how long that camera has been out without any updates. Hopefully Panasonic looks into that and tries to improve on it. Hopefully Ohm Systems tries to improve on their lower end as well. We'll see. Let me know in the comments what you are interested in with this format, or do you think it's even going to survive long term? It's got a photography Banzai. Thanks.